Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the presentation of our paper linking web tracking data with survey data to improve the study of online pornography consumption. My name is Pascal Siegers, and this is joint work together with Maximilian von Andrian-Werburg and Johannes Breuer. As usually, before we present the results from the data analysis, we will shortly discuss the motivation for our research and some theories to understand the phenomenon. Research on pornography, sometimes also called sexually explicit media or SEM, is mostly conducted in medicine and psychology. It's concerned with mental and physical health outcomes and presumes negative social consequences of porn use. The results from existing studies about detrimental effects of porn use are inconsistent and disputed. In addition, definitions and measurements of pornography have been inconsistent. The measurement is almost always based on self-reports in survey studies, and in many cases, especially in psychology, the samples contain students only. The clearest result from existing research is that men use SEM more frequently than women. The meta-analysis by Patterson and Hyde quoted on the slide shows that differences in the sexual behavior of men and women are overall small. They appear to be the most visible in autoerotic behaviors like porn consumption or masturbation, even if women seem to have different preferences than men. Moreover, existing studies showed a negative correlation between age and porn use and, at least in the US, an ambivalent relationship with religion. In the following, we decided to focus on the obvious gender gap between men and women for the remaining of the studies. We selected 4 theories explaining the gender gap in porn use. First, the sexual strategies theory argues that the gender gap results from gender-specific reproductive strategies. Women prefer long-term mating strategies because they invest more in their offspring. They will place an emphasis on the quality of the man in terms of stability and resources. Men, in contrast, prefer quantity, which, according to evolutionary psychology, results in an overall higher level of sexual activity. According to this perspective, the gap in sexual activity also explains the gender gap in pornography use, because the men are lacking sexual opportunities, given that the women are more restrictive. In contrast, the life history theory posits a life cycle effect. Sexuality is stronger in younger ages because this is the moment where procreation is important. Later, sexuality is replaced by other life concerns. Porn consumption decreases, and the gender gap should also decrease with age. The third theory, the social structural theory, is more critical of pornography. From this perspective, women are objects of male sexual satisfaction. If men watch porn but women do not, the reason is that women are most often presented as sexual objects in pornography. If this is the case, more negative attitudes towards women should be correlated with more online pornography consumption. Finally, the cognitive social learning theory argues that individuals learn behavior from imitating others. This process, I would argue as a sociologist, is embedded into the moral communities of societies. If sexual behaviors are strongly condemned, individuals are less likely to perform them. In Germany, for example, restrictive moral standards for sexuality are promoted by the religious denominations. The existing gender gap could result from the fact that women are overall more religious than men. Therefore, we would expect that religious individuals use less pornography, although the existing evidence is mixed on this. In addition, I would argue that changing social norms could also affect learning behaviors. Younger generations might adopt more liberal moral views because the social norms have become more liberal. Based on these short theoretical considerations, our paper addresses the following 2 research questions. The first is descriptive and asks whether our web tracking data allows us to reproduce results on the gender gap in pornography use. The second is more analytic and asks whether we can explain the gender gap in SEM use by different attitudes regarding gender roles, religious profiles, or differences in social demographic attributes. We will present results from 2 studies. The first is the web tracking study. For this purpose, we purchased web tracking data from the Respondi web tracking panel. Participants self-selected into the panel and are incentivized for getting tracked. The data contains top-level domains and timestamps. We can model the number of visits, the time spent on websites, and we are able to characterize web sessions. The panel consists of 2,000 participants per month, with overall 3,000 participants over the 12 months observation period. Each month generated roughly 8 million website visits. To measure online pornography use, we used predefined categories from the panel providers and checked all websites with more than 1,000 total visits from the total lists of websites. We excluded online sex shops and casual dating sites, but included video, photo, and camera portals. An online Zem user is a participant who visited at least one of the sites during the tracking period. This table shows the gender gap in porn use in our web tracking sample. 2/3 of the men, but only a quarter of the women in the sample visited a porn website. Overall, a little bit less than half of the sample showed this behavior. And it's important to know that these results resemble a lot what survey studies on porn consumption found. This figure shows the number of porn websites visited per day for men and women. The red line is the sample mean of visits for all days. The gender gap is obvious in the data. Women visit consistently less websites than men. For men, the fluctuation is evident within the weekdays and across the year. A close inspection of the time variation showed that men's consumption depends on sport events and is lowest on Christmas Eve. The consumption pattern for women seems much more stable. And this is not only true for the number of visits of porn websites, it's also true for the total amount of time spent on porn websites. Here is the example for June and July 2018. And what you see is a very similar pattern regarding the time spent on porn sites by gender. This information is interesting because it shows how web tracking data allows for quantifying the gender gap in online use virtually in seconds. Finally, we visualize the gender gap depending on age categories for men and women. The pattern shows a small decrease with age for men, but strong differences across age groups for women. This result is in line with the life history theory, but also with the cognitive social learning approach. And the pattern is very similar to results from a German survey study on porn use that was published in 2018 and uses a very similar operationalization because they asked respondents whether they used pornographic materials once at least for the last 12 months. To answer our second research question, we linked survey data to the web tracking data on pornography use. The web tracking allows for quantifying the gender gap in a new way, as we have shown. From the 2,000 panelists, roughly 1,300 completed our online survey. The results from the social demographics show that the sample is slightly biased compared to the general population. Participants are more likely to be male, somewhat younger, and more highly educated. We decided to include 4 blocks of indicators or predictors in the model. This figure summarizes the regression model we are going to test. In the upper part of the figure, you see the predictors that we deduced from the social structural theory, arguing that sexual behaviors, including pornography use, are influenced by negative attitudes towards women. We estimate these predictors as latent variables and included a selection of items from relevant gender attitude scales. So first is the hostile sexism scale from the ambivalent sexism inventory. The second, a subset from the modern sexism inventory. We added third, items measuring traditional gender roles. And fourth, we included a scale for social dominance orientation because this concept stands for a generalized depreciation of other groups, potentially including women. In the middle of the figure, the indicators for women and relationship status measure assumptions of the sexual strategy theory. So the dummy for women, for sex, measures different sexual activity levels between men and women, and relationship status, the opportunity structure for sexual contact. Then we have age and an interaction effect between age and sex, because we assume that there is, if the life cycle theory is right, a negative effect of age, but the descriptive data has shown us that this effect should be stronger for women. Finally, we included religiosity and denomination to test the cognitive learning approach, because the moral communities that are represented by the religious denominations promote prohibitive sexual behavior. So we expect more religious individuals to use porn less frequently. Our modeling strategy is twofold. First, we estimate the logistic regression on them use versus non-use, so as a binary dependent variable, and in the second step, we estimate a linear regression on the average monthly SEM visits if respondents had at least one visit during the tracking period. Before we ran the regression models, we excluded a couple of respondents, about 20 respondents, that had a lot of porn visits, and we assume that they could be highly influential cases. This figure summarizes the results of the logistic regression model. So the first and most important finding is that we still have a large effect of sex. So women consume less than men, and the other attributes that we control for do not explain away this difference. It's obvious that the upper part of the figure, that the attitudes toward women and the social dominance orientation are not significant. What we find is a significant interaction effect between sex and age. This means that the age effect is significant in the group of women, but not in the group of men. So men do not change significantly, but women do. And this finding gives credit to the cognitive learning approach more than to the life history theory, because this would expect the effect in both groups. The current relationship status has effects in the right direction, but that are not significant, so not supporting the sexual strategy theory, but the strong sex effect, of course, does. Finally, what we find is that members of Catholic Church and other denominations are less likely to use online pornography, but self-rated religiosity has no effect. Turning to the number of visits per month as a dependent variable, by and large confirms the findings from the logistic regression. Gender attitudes have no effect, even if we include them one by one in the model, and the only strong effect is the negative effect of sex. With exception of Catholic Church membership, all other effects are not significant. This means that the age does not influence the frequency of use, only the likelihood of use. And interestingly, Catholics are less likely to visit a porn website, but if they do so more frequently. In terms of our theoretical assumptions, the results from both models suggest that the gender gap in porn use might be the byproduct of different sexual activity levels of men and women. The age effect for women might result from social change more than a life cycle effect. In conjunction with the small effect of religiosity, this might provide some support for the cognitive learning approach. As a conclusion, I would argue that web checking data serve for descriptive purposes and for detailed pattern analysis. It's well possible to quantify the gender gap in online SEM use, and, which is also an advantage, it helps avoiding sensitive questions in surveys. Regarding the key findings, our results do not dramatically differ from results that were reported from survey studies. One exception here is maybe that there is an age effect for women, but not for men in our sample. But regarding the effect of sex, of religiosity, of relationship status, our results are very much in line with what you can read in the literature. Of course, our analysis has important limitations that are mostly due to the nature of the data. First, we did not use a probability sample from the German online population, but a convenience sample. Participants self-selected into the panel and are incentivized for the participation in the web tracking and the completion of the survey. Second, the tracking data has quality issues because participants can pause the web tracking, and we do not know which respondents make use of this opportunity when consuming SEM. And we only have top-level domain data available. Receiving the full URLs could allow us to distinguish different styles of SEM use and to learn more about specific preferences of participants. The data could potentially be used to measure habitual use of online SEM and distinguish different temporal usage patterns. And finally, our paper focuses on online pornography. Offline pornography is not covered. The share of online versus offline pornography has not been studied recently for Germany, so it's difficult to know whether we are biased here or not. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.